Now, back to the 3rd century. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor. Now, he's the last of the 5 good emperors. Under him, even though he's considered a good emperor, but beginning with him, things began to turn south for, pardon the expression, but things began to turn bad for Rome. And Rome experienced earthquakes and fires and freezes and things that they hadn't experienced much before. In the meantime, all this created unrest. The people living here, with climate change, they were forced to move south, and they found the Roman Empire weakened, and that, hey, well, we can move there. So the German people might have been forced to move by a big climate change to where their own lands were no longer producing. All their herds were having to head south, so they had to follow the herds. So the German peoples began to move. Now, some years ago, there was a movie made called Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and it showed that Marcus Aurelius' son, Commodus, poisoned his father to become emperor. That has not been proven. Even though we do know of 5 good emperors, every one of the 5 were handpicked by the predecessor and groomed to be emperor. And Commodus felt like, hey, I'm his son, but if he does like the other emperors, he'll bypass me. So he decided, I'm going to take matters in my own hand and become emperor myself. But now we don't know if he killed his father or not, but basically, unlike the others, Commodus was a blood son who actually took over after his father's death and was the worst emperor that Rome had had up to that time. He took on 12 titles and then redid the calendar and named all the months of the year after his 12 titles he took. Basically saying, I'm going to name. He actually set himself up as a god, more so than the others had. Unlike the others who said, I'll become a god when I die, he actually demanded that he be worshipped. Again, the other ones had also, but he more so than the others. The phenomenon is called megalomania. Don't worry about that word, but he was a megalomaniac. And he neglected to visit the empire, including he neglected the wars to the east. The people finally had stood all of him they could, and they killed him, like they had Nero. When they did, now folk, by 21st century standards, this is disgraceful, but in those days, they didn't have the standards we do. They sold the title, the office of emperor to an auction. Sold to the highest bidder. And a man named Septimus Severus, S-E-V-E-R-U-S, I'm going to write that down because he founded the Severan dynasty, which your book mentions, did revive the Roman Empire a little bit. The Severan dynasty, but again, he initially purchased the empire, the office of the emperor, and set himself up and ruled for several years, passed the throne on to his son and his grandson. And for a while, they restored some semblance of peace or order, but then the decline kept on going. Now, it got so bad that during a 50-year period, Rome had 24 emperors, 23 of whom were assassinated, murdered. The only one who wasn't was one who was already about 83 when he got the job, held it for a few months and died probably of old age. The rest of them, they'd have one emperor after another, and they didn't like any one of them. It was said they would groan under the weight of really heavy-handed emperors who didn't allow them to do anything, and they longed for one who would allow them more freedom. They got an emperor who allowed more freedom, and they said, whoops, he's worse than the others, and it became a saying among Romans, the only thing worse than having an emperor who doesn't allow anything is to have an emperor who allows everything. They couldn't stand. What's that?
Like Rome by when?
I'm talking the period of time around the 200s, late 100s and early 200s. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, your book calls it Christ the 2nd century. The 2nd century is a period from 100 to 199. So you're talking the late 100s. Now, this situation was getting really out of hand. Now, oh yes, your book talks about how that Rome began to hire German mercenaries. They couldn't find the men. Now, part of the reason was the Roman men did not want to serve any army. Actually, there were three problems that Romans had with its army. Number one, the men didn't want to serve. Number two, the Roman men had become too, I don't know what word to use, too weak, too effeminate, or too soft to be any use as a soldier. But then number three, the real reason is the Roman men had never been born because their parents, the parents were not having children, the people were not marrying, so that there was a population decline. This you can prove, and the population decline was not caused so much by the wars and pestilence, even though this occurred. The population decline was caused in large part by the fact that their men and women did not like each other. All right, late Roman Empire. Late in the empire, you finally wind up with two reform-minded emperors, and they were Diocletian and Constantine. Diocletian got tired of the chaos and took over. Once he had taken over as emperor, he said it's too much for one man to administer all the empire. So he split the empire into, you might say, 4 parts. He took one and they had 3 other men take over the other. With the understanding, hey, I'm the head. But you 3 men, you take care of this part, you take care of this, you take care of this. Diocletian ruled for a good many years. And he made a law also that all people must stay in the profession of the fathers. Basically, he tried to freeze prices, freeze wages. Now, folk, from a 21st century standpoint, this is one of the worst things he could have done. But he was trying to keep down inflation. Now, a big problem that Romans had with their money, in those days, folk, money consisted of gold and silver coins. I mean, today money is often paper, and even more recently, we don't even use paper anymore, but money is plastic cards, or bank account. When we work and get paid, the pay is entered as an entry in our bank account and not given to us. But at one time, money was gold and silver coins. Well, here was the problem. Now, I'm going to be talking about this later on in the chapter. China had built this Silk Road that went from China all the way to the Mediterranean world. Now, its route varied from generation to generation. In one generation, it might go through the mountains, depending on the political stability of the regions involved. In another generation, it might go through India, and sometimes it went even through northern Arabia. In other words, they took the route that where they were felt was safest. Now, I want to state this: no Chinese trader ever started out in China and wound up here in the Mediterranean world. As far as never happened. Instead, the Chinese would trade their goods, silk, porcelain, steel, or whatever. They trade their goods to a middleman, who in turn would march a few hundred miles and trade to another middleman. And he'd march a few hundred miles, trade to another middleman. By the time the goods reached the Mediterranean world, each of these middlemen had made a profit. So the price of these Roman goods, these Chinese goods, was really, really high. Well, what the Chinese received for all this was gold. So most of your gold and silver coins found their way out of Rome and into China. And I've been told with some Chinese, you go to China today, they still have those Roman coins, are still there, silver coins from Roman time. Still there, they never found their way back. Basically, Europe became gold depleted, and it was to remain depleted of gold for about 1,500 years. Now, well, let's make that about 1,300. In the 1500s, Europeans went to the New World and stole tons of gold from the American Indians, and then gold became a big part of Europe again. But for about 1,300 years, there was very little gold in Europe, so Europe's economy went into a dark age. Anyway, Diocletian tried to say that every man should remain in the profession of his father. So if your father were a baker, you must be a baker. If your father were a tanner, blacksmith, you must remain a blacksmith. And if your father were a soldier, you had to remain a soldier. Again, folk, with our 21st century concepts of liberty and economic opportunity, we have to judge him harshly for this, but he didn't know any better. He believed he was going to bring some kind of stability. I mean, after all, I mean, you know, you ask 8 and 9-year-old kids what they want to be. I mean, at least in my day, the kids are, well, I want to be a Major League Baseball player. Well, guess what, folks? Most of them never made a team. But our market economy solved the problem by, hey, you might have a dream of being one thing, but economic can force you into something else. Eventually you find your niche. Eventually you find your turn of your own free will and your own volition. Not because some dictator said, you become a soldier, you become a leather maker, and you become a factory worker. You know. But anyway, he tried to control it. All right, Diocletian retired. When he retired, each of the 4 men he appointed began to struggle for power. You might say like they had a tournament. 2 of them, well, these 2 fought and these 2 fought. Then the winners fought, take all, winner take all. So 2 men over here fought, the loser was destroyed. The 2 over here fought, the loser destroyed. Well, one of the winners of one of the contests was a young man named Constantine. All right, now, folks, Constantine is remembered as being the first Christian emperor. Now, was his conversion genuine?
No.
This question has been asked from the beginning, and in fact, a few years back, my wife asked me, was his conversion? I had to answer, I simply don't know. This has been argued. There's this side and there's this side. Now, one of the 12 books I had to read for a master's exam was entitled The Conversion of Constantine, where the author said that, oh yeah, he believed Constantine's conversion was genuine. Here's why. At the time, there were only about 10% of the empire were Christians. For Constantine to all of a sudden say to his troops, I'm going to have you all converted to Christianity before we march into battle, seemed like political suicide. The only thing redeeming can be said about it was he won the battle. Now, according to his own account, the night before the battle, with the enemy like right across the other side of the hill and him on one side, he had this dream. And in this dream, he saw a cross, which he recognized being a sign of, every Roman knew about Christianity. And around the cross were the words, Latin words, by this sign conquer. Constantine woke up believing the dream was a real message from God. Had his army put crosses on all their shields, had them paint crosses on their shields, had them sew crosses on all their uniforms really fast, and went into battle under the sign of the cross, which seems like it was committing political and military suicide, except he won the battle. Now, I had a high school football coach. I overheard him say one time, any play that works had to have been a good call. I don't necessarily agree with that. I've seen what looks like a really bad call work and a really good call not work. But nevertheless, you can't argue with it. He conquered.